What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we will be breaking down must-start running backs for Week 17 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. Keep in mind, during today's video, we are going over slightly lower tier running backs who you guys may be having second thoughts on. Obvious must starts like Derrick Henry or Christian McCaffrey will not be mentioned in the video, but without further ado, let's hop into today's video. One of the key aspects for players on today's list are going to be incredible matchups, and there is not a running back with a better matchup here in Week 17 than Travis Etienne against the Houston Texans, the team that is allowing the most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. Etienne looked really good in Week 16 against the Jets in kind of a sloppy, gross weather Thursday night football game. 83 yards on the ground, 29 receiving yards off of 3 receptions, 14.2 fantasy points after having 12.7 fantasy points in Week 15. It really felt like last week this Jaguars offense ran through Travis Etienne, and I would be willing to bet in Week 17 that the Jaguars will rely on Etienne heavily. He will get plenty of touches in this game. He will be targeted a couple of times in this game by Trevor Lawrence, and there's just no way that the game plan this week against the Texans will not involve Etienne running the football a ton. He is the definition of a must-start running back against the Houston Texans here in Week 17. Next up on the list, we've got DALVIN Cook going up against the Green Bay Packers. We had him on the must-start list in Week 15 against the Indianapolis Colts. He had 27 points in Week 15. Last week against the Giants, I thought Cook was a pretty solid play as well. 10.7 points for him last week, 64 yards on the ground and 3 receptions for 13 receiving yards, but ultimately still hit that double-digit fantasy mark. The Green Bay Packers have been struggling against opposing running backs so far on the season. This will be a competitive game, a must-win game for the Green Bay Packers in terms of their playoff hopes. And on the other hand, you've got the Vikings battling for the best potential playoff seeding, so should be a good competitive matchup within the same division. You know, both of these teams are not going to want to see the other team. I'd imagine that DALVIN Cook will have success in this matchup. I think he's just a really solid start. He's been a player who throughout the season we've gotten a lot of questions on, right? He's had some really high points kind of mid-season, weeks 5 to week 10. Then he had some low points between weeks 11 and week 14. In the last 2 weeks, kind of a tough read, 27 points and 10 points. So I just think if you're questioning DALVIN Cook going into the week, he's a really solid start approaching Week 17. All right, next up on the list, we've got James Conner going up against the Atlanta Falcons, a team that has heavily struggled against opposing running backs. When we look at what Conner's done, 11 or more fantasy points in every matchup since Week 9, since his return from injury. Overall, Conner's had a solid season, missed 3 games, kind of struggled towards the beginning of the year outside of Week 1 and I guess Week 4 against the Panthers, where he had 10 points. He had 8.7 or less points in his other 3 matchups. But at the end of the day, Conner has had a nice season. Going into last week, getting a lot of questions about James Conner. You know, my main emphasis was it really hasn't mattered who James Conner has gone up against. You know, against Denver, 18 points, against New England, 23 points, even against the Niners in Week 11, 13 points. He had some weaker matchups against Seattle, the Rams, and the Chargers, you know, in between, but overall, he's played really good football since his return from injury, double digits in every matchup. And I was a little bit concerned going into Week 16, even though, you know, like I said, I was telling you guys, it just doesn't matter who James Conner plays. What I was more concerned about was the quarterback play out of Trace McSorley, and once again, just none of it mattered. James Conner, 25 fantasy points in Week 16. That was a season high against a good Tampa Bay Buccaneers run defense. 79 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 7 receptions for 41 receiving yards, and he gets a stellar matchup against the Falcons in Week 17. There's no doubt in my mind James Conner is a solidified must-start moving into the week. All right, A.J. Dillon has come to life since Week 12 of the fantasy season, 12.8 or more fantasy points in every single matchup with a ceiling of 22.1 fantasy points in Week 15. He gets the Minnesota Vikings, a unit that is allowing the 12th most fantasy points to the position. So outside of the top 10 worst teams, but overall still a team that has struggled. We talked about this matchup earlier in the video when we went over Dalvin Cook. Should be a competitive matchup, but most importantly, a must-win situation for the Green Bay Packers. We know that Aaron Jones is dealing with an injury as well. He at the moment is listed as questionable, but I really wouldn't be surprised if Jones is good to go. But if Jones is out, that is even better for A.J. Dillon. If Jones plays, I still think A.J. Dillon is a running back that we want as a solid RB2 or a flex option moving into Week 17. Holy cannoli, Cam Akers went crazy in Week 16, 34.7 fantasy points against the Denver Broncos, 118 yards on the ground, 3 touchdowns and 2 receptions for 29 receiving yards. Akers has double-digit fantasy points, 13 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups, 9.3 fantasy points, including a touchdown in Week 14. Over the last month, Cam Akers has looked like a solid option at the running back position, a solid flex option, and he gets the Chargers going into Week 17, a unit that has struggled against the running back position. You got the Chargers looking to get the best possible outcome in terms of their playoff opportunity, and then you've got the Rams with really nothing to lose whatsoever in this matchup. They're really trying to just gain as much momentum and figure out what they have in terms of their players who are healthy, and I really think there's no reason why Cam Akers won't go off once again here in Week 17. I'm not expecting 34 fantasy points, but another double-digit fantasy point performance I think is very realistic approaching the week. Brian Robinson was a player we really did not like going into Week 16, a player that we did not recommend starting unless you were extremely, and I mean last bare minimum option desperate, right? Brian Robinson faced the San Francisco 49ers, had 5.8 fantasy points in Week 16, still looked decent on the ground, 58 rushing yards, but that was off of 22 rushing attempts. Overall, just a very tough matchup against the Niners. We knew we didn't like him last week, but in Week 17, he gets the Cleveland Browns, a unit that is ranking in the bottom 5 against opposing running backs from a fantasy perspective. When we look at Robinson's past couple weeks before Week 16, he hit double digits in every game since Week 10 except Week 11 against the Texans, and still had 57 yards on the ground in that matchup. So ultimately, I think that Brian Robinson, if you're in need of an RB2, if you're in need of a flex option, will bounce back against the Cleveland Browns here in Week 17. All right, last but not least, I want to talk about Tyler Allgeier facing the Arizona Cardinals, a unit that has just looked awful against opposing running backs in the bottom 10 against the position. They just got torched by both Rachaad White and Leonard Fournette, both on the ground and through the air in Week 16. Tyler Allgeier has 15.7 or more fantasy points in his last 2 matchups, at least 74 yards on the ground in his last 2 matchups, and over 100 yards from scrimmage in his last 2 matchups. This is a no-brainer play. Allgeier, a very solid RB2, a very solid flex option. I know there's been some worry throughout the season with how many different running backs the Falcons have used at times, but looking at the last 2 weeks where Allgeier has 17 or more touches, and in the previous 2 starts where he has 10 or more touches, I think Allgeier is a lock for double-digit touches on the ground. And the other aspect we saw last week was his involvement in the passing game, where he really shined as well as he did earlier in the season, right? So Allgeier, a player I have really liked all off season, a player I really rooted for this season. I really hope he is kind of that missing piece for your fantasy team as we approach Week 17 of the fantasy season. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today or find it helpful, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and please feel free to drop any questions, comments, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can, and be sure to look out for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you there. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.